What's up, everybody? Welcome in. Great to be back with you, and great to have week 2 of the NFL season on the horizon. I am Adam Kaufman. He is Greg Ehrenberg. You're used to seeing him a zillion times a week. And this right here is the Yahoo NFL Thursday Night Football Show, and we are excited. Again, the focus is on Yahoo, and we'll talk more about Yahoo in a moment. But just like the people demanded, Greg, a matchup between Washington and the New York Giants.
Well, you know what the people really wanted? They really wanted us to be doing a show together. It's been a meaningful period of time. You and I have done, I don't know, like hundreds of shows together, but it's been hours. It's been a very long time. We've done fake football shows together. We've done play-by-play for video game footballs. We've done all kinds of other ones, and now reunited. Now it's football season again, so it's cool. Hopefully we keep this pairing together for Thursdays. I
love it. Let's do it every week. And if we had more than a half hour right now, I would say we spend the first 15 minutes just catching up. But we may alienate our listeners just a little bit. We won't do that. Before we dive into the game itself and all sorts of great projections out there from Yahoo, let's tell you a little bit about Yahoo, our presenting sponsor for this show. We'll give you some details. You'll be able to read them if you don't feel like listening along with me. But here are the details, folks. You want to start this NFL season off right with the Yahoo Daily Fantasy. It's all available to you. To celebrate, we have a brand new exclusive deal thanks to our partnership with Yahoo. You can get, listen to this, 2 free months of Awesemo Plus Platinum. You heard me right. 2 free months. To qualify, now here's the big thing. You got to be new to Yahoo. Sign up for an account via the link in the description below. Deposit and play. All right. Yahoo will send us your name after you play in your first paid contest. We will reach out via email with your coupon. If you need immediate access because you want to play today, well, that's fine. That's easy enough. Email support@awesemo.com and we will get you set up. Just to emphasize, this offer is for new Yahoo users only. If you're already a Yahoo user, you won't be eligible for this particular promo, but once you have signed up, you can make sure to enter tonight's single game $100,000 NFL baller contest. And with your 2 free months of Awesemo Plus Platinum, you will have access to our tools and projections specifically designed for Yahoo DFS to help you take down those big Yahoo contests and other contests to win big with Yahoo DFS. So take advantage and join Yahoo today. And as I always tell you, I harp on it. I may start to do gimmicks for it. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button here as you watch along on the Awesemo YouTube page. We greatly appreciate it. But before we go position by position, just overarching thoughts on this game. We can joke about what, Thursday night football in general coming off the short week, and then it's a matchup of these two teams. You don't even get Ryan Fitzpatrick out there. It's Taylor Heineke. But how do we feel about this one?
Should be low scoring, and I think our lineup. I think our lineups should kind of reflect that. In other showdown contests, single game contests we've done this year, I haven't prioritized the defenses. We go look over at the projections we have on Awesemo.com for tonight's Yahoo slate, and we have Washington and the Giants, their defensive units, as 2 of the higher projected players in this game, and both of them rate out pretty well on just a value basis. We have, well, not necessarily points per dollar, but the Giants projected for about 8.5 fantasy points. Washington projected for nearly 10 fantasy points. Those are kind of projections you don't usually see for defenses. So it's definitely going to change the overall construct of the slate.
So some people in the chat here, any thoughts, any questions, comments you guys have, by all means, get them in and we will review, see, how we can advise you. I like this from everyone. Everyone hates Chris with a whole bunch of, different ways of saying that. I'm going no QBs in my lineups. Forget it. LMAO. I mean, it's easy to look at Heineke and easy to look at Daniel Jones and just say, okay, I'm gonna go elsewhere. That fine. I wouldn't bug you about it on a Sunday if we're talking main slate. But when it comes to just general showdown structure, you play these all the time. How much do you alienate yourself? How much do you put yourself at risk by not having exposure to the quarterbacks, no matter what you think of them, just because, again, it's the one game?
Also, that's a pretty good starting point, because we're going to talk about the quarterbacks first anyway. And these are the 2 players we have projected the highest for this game in our projections today. Mm-hmm. Taylor Heineke projected for 18.05 fantasy points at $23. Daniel Jones projected for 16.3 fantasy points at $20. And the other thing we have to think about here when it comes to this game as a whole, there are so many just not great offensive players, not very many great high upside guys for this particular matchup. Just the pricing is pretty modest. The most expensive player we have here, Antonio Gibson at $24, tied with Saquon Barkley also at $24. And, I don't think either of them are necessarily locks to be massive plays or anything like that. So the majority of the lineups I've built so far, they leave a lot of salary on the table. And so that's something where you just kind of look at some of the guys at the top. There are no real stringent salary restrictions to the Yahoo pricing today. So when you're considering not playing Heineke or Jones, that means you're really expecting 6 other players to outscore them because pricing is kind of a non-issue on this slate.
Yeah, I just don't see how. And again, maybe there's some element of showdown bias, and so you're drawn to the quarterbacks because generally, if your receiver goes off, whomever it is that you trust, in this case, it's Terry McLaurin, it's a pass catcher like Logan Thomas, whoever it is that you're leaning on, you're relying upon. Generally, the quarterbacks are going to have themselves a pretty good night if one or a collection of receivers go off. But this is not, Chiefs Bucks, right? Like we had last week for Thursday night to kick off the season. It's not. Well, and let's pretend that those quarterbacks weren't Patrick Mahomes and Tom Brady and they were Taylor Heineke and Daniel Jones. Well, sure, you can make the case to fade the QBs because I want more Kelsey and more Hill and more Godwin and more Evans and more, you name it. This game is not that. That's not what you have here at your disposal. I feel like you're doing yourself a disservice by not only going with one quarterback, I think you need to have both of them in there.
Yeah, so in the build that I've made so far, not my final one, is just the one that I kind of throw out. I put some rules into Fantasy Cruncher and say, like, all right, just based on our projections, what am I going to get in terms of exposure if I just ran these lineups as is? I get Daniel Jones and Taylor Heineke both around 90% of my lineup. So they're the two players that we have projected to be the highest. Like I said, salary constraints really a non-issue here, and I just think that the most likely scenario is that these guys end up being highest scoring players on the slate. If you go look at the tool we have just for single game projections, we have Taylor Heineke with a 22% chance to be the top scoring player in this game, and then a 60% chance to be one of the 2 to 5 next top scoring players. So the odds of Daniel Jones and by the way, it's very similar odds also for Daniel Jones to Taylor Heineke. Looking at both of these guys, but very, very high percentage chance of being one of the top score players, to the point where it's really almost 9 out of 10 times these guys end up being the highest scoring player in this game. So it's really, really difficult to envision a scenario where one, if not both of them, end up in the optimal lineup. At least one of them, I think, almost certainly will be in.
So your projections, as you outlined before, but also ownership in particular, you've got those guys even more often than our own Alex Baker going on his projections for Awesemo, looking at Fantasy Cruncher here. I ran it, and, people out there who have the subscription to Awesemo Plus, you can do it yourselves as well. But the ownership is not as great, for the QBs is what you have based on your projections. He is Daniel Jones as the number one owned player at 61% of lineups, just, running the top 100. That was the sample size.
Is that including the superstar exposure, though? You got to add those two together.
Oh, that's true, actually. Yeah, that's true. I was thinking overall ownership and then superstar separate. So yeah, 96 when you put those. Yeah. So yeah, I guess pretty comparable, and then 90 at Heineke. So you're right.
And that's just those are just the optimal lineups, not necessarily Correct. If you were to run a sim and see what the actual odds are. But yeah, if you just run the optimal lineups, you would have to run a whole bunch of ones before you got to a lineup that didn't have. Actually, I'm kind of curious. If I ran 1,000 lineups in Fantasy Cruncher, yeah, if it would generate a single one that doesn't have Heineke or Jones, I'm going to do that right now. My gut feeling is no. I think it's probably going to have both, not both of them, but at least one of them in every lineup, because it's a situation where they project so much better than every other player, and the salary is an issue. And the other thing to consider also, look at the other players. Mm-hmm. What happens in a scenario where neither Taylor Heineke or Daniel Jones end up in the optimal lineups? I guess we're assuming the defenses are in it. Yeah. It can't really be wide receivers, because the wide receivers would presumably have to catch touchdown passes from the quarterbacks. So we're looking at Washington's defense, the Giants defense, Saquon Barkley, Antonio Gibson, and then what for the last 2 spots? I think at the very least, I think you should have both quarterbacks, certainly in cash game lineups, GPP lineups on the whole as well. But at the very least, you have to have one. I don't really see a situation where neither quarterback ends up being optimal.
Well, so I'll do this just for giggles, again, based on Alex's projections. And so the top optimal build right now has a projected total of 66.87 points for tonight's game, with Heineke in that superstar spot and Daniel Jones also part of that lineup. If I take the QBs out of the build entirely, they're not even an option, and I calculate your top build, 57.68. So it's not wildly far off. It's not wildly far off, but it is about 10 points less, 57.68. And you've got in that lineup still neither defense, but you've got, obviously both your top running backs, and we're assuming health for Saquon Barkley, who's a little bit banged up and was limited during the week, but he's in there. Antonio Gibson is your superstar in that lineup. So we'll see. Interestingly, let's see, scrolling down, looking, the DSTs, at least for Alex's projections, they still don't even factor in when I do 100 lineups.
So if you go into Fantasy Cruncher, you're going to have to change the settings, because the default is going to be for no players versus defense. And that's impossible to make the lineup set. So you have to change the settings. Set it to, I have for Showdown, I have it set to max 2 players versus defense, and that will change it a little bit. But also, I'm kind of curious on the point of the quarterbacks. Now, by the way, I ran 1,000 lineups. Every single one of them had at least one quarterback in. I'm going to take both quarterbacks out and see what the optimal lineup ends up being. Also, there's always weird injury situations. Like, all right, maybe something crazy happens. Daniel Jones gets hurt, and then who's the Giants back right now? Mike Lennon. Like, sure, maybe that happens, but that's not something I would ever really build my lineups around. But all right, the lineup that comes up with the most fantasy points, if you take Taylor Heineke and Daniel Jones out, ends up, let's see, I have to take them out of the star also, only ends up projected for 57 fantasy points, which is, considerably lower than some of the other ones who went. And this is the highest projected lineup that we have in our projections. If you were to take out the quarterbacks, it would be Antonio Gibson, Dynami Brown, Sterling Shepard, Terry McLaurin, Saquon Barkley. But it's a situation. What's the logical scenario where 2 Washington wide receivers end up in the opposite lineup and not their quarterback? It still seems like a pretty unlikely proposition.
Yeah. So you got the same build that I pulled up even before, changing the rules. So yeah.
Well,
so
for that also, I had to delete the rules, because I can't have, stack settings with quarterbacks and then not have the quarterbacks. So it would ruin everything.
Exactly. Somebody says in the chat, where to go, jumped on me. Oh, drop roses. I'm telling y'all, Washington football team's going to win this game. And I guess, I would ask you this, like, would that be that big a shock? Based on what Washington's defense is versus the Giants defense, you don't have Evan Ingram on the other side. And, again, Saquon is banged up. Yes, you don't have Ryan Fitzpatrick if you're Washington. I wouldn't be at all surprised if Washington wins this game.
They're favored. I'm never going to be shocked when a favorite wins a game. I did bet the Giants earlier in the week at +4.5 when Fitzpatrick was first rolled out, and that spread is currently 3. So I'm good with the 4.5 I have on the Giants. If I had to take a side of the game, it would be New York. But no, it's a tight game. I think the defense, they're both really good here. I'm very concerned about both the offenses. Number one, Heineke quarterback for Washington. I understand he's had some success in very limited sample size quarterbacking for them. And then the Giants, I think the Giants have a lot of good skill position players. It just doesn't matter when your offensive line sucks. Who can't block for a quarterback, can't block for the running back. But actually, I kind of think this is a good transition point to the running back. So I want to ask you, how confident are you in Saquon Barkley's health right now and the kind of workload that he's going to get?
Not super confident. And I think that should be somewhat reflected in what the ownership projections are, again, based on what I was just looking at for Fantasy Crunchers. Saquon right now in the, let's see. I shouldn't say that. He's projected for about 80% ownership, so very high because he's just a hard guy to fade. That being said, it's not like he was in a situation last week where you're given this vote of confidence to what the season's going to be for him. Based on what last year was, he's again limited being during the week. I don't think he's going to go off. I think if I'm more inclined, and I haven't built out a lineup here for Yahoo personally just yet. I've just been running through crunches and seeing what our experts, what Alex, what you, what others say about it. But personally, I could make an argument for fading Saquon and going in another direction, put both QBs in, going with Antonio Gibson, fitting Mclaurin in if it works to have Logan Thomas in there as well. And then, you have one other guy, whatever you have room for, basically. I don't feel like Saquon's a guy that you have to roster tonight.
So here's my feelings on him. I prefer every single player that's priced around him to him, just because I'm so concerned about the workload, even though it looks like he's going to play at this point in time. In the offseason, they were iffy about whether he was going to play or not to open the season, coming off the torn ACL and all the knee issues he had last year. He missed basically the entire season. So now coming into this game, it's a short week. He was limited in practice the other day. I had him listed as questionable. Obviously, there's upside there. So if I'm playing 150 lineups, it's not like I'm taking him out of my player pool entirely. But I'd rather get to Taylor Heineke, who's, by the way, Saquon Barkley, he's tied with Antonio Gibson as the most expensive player over on Yahoo for the single game contest today. And of the players priced around, I'd rather roster Taylor Heineke at $23. I'd rather roster Daniel Jones at $20. I'd rather roster Antonio Gibson at the same price. Mm-hmm. I'd rather roster Terry McLaurin for $1 less. So with all that considered, for a one-game slate, it's really difficult to call any player an outright fade to get 0% exposure to. But I like everybody who's priced around him more. I just have so little confidence in, number one, how much reps Barkley's going to get on the short week. And then number two, the Giants' ability to be able to block for him at all against a very strong front seven for Washington.
He only had 13 total touches last week between 3 targets and the 10 times on the ground. That's it. Now, that being said, they didn't rush a ton in general. The Giants only rushed 20 times, and it was obviously mostly Barkley. Booker was somewhat involved, and then Daniel Jones had 6. But for the most part, Jones was throwing the ball. He threw the ball almost 40 times. It was largely the guys that you would expect it to be, especially without Ingram available to you. It was Shepard, it was Slayton, it was Golladay. Rudolph got involved some because you got to factor in a tight end somewhere, and then it was just scattered targets from there. But I think that's what the general game plan is going to be again tonight.
But also don't forget that game. The Giants were completely terrible. And the game was non-competitive around halftime. Yes. So with that in mind,
they had to throw more.
They had to throw. Like if you're expecting me to project how many pass attempts that Daniel Jones has, it's way under 40. That's not something I would expect to repeat again. But I do think the Giants are more inclined to throw the ball than run it.
Yeah, especially if we're of the mind that the favorite is going to win, if Washington's going to win this game. Now, will it be close? Will it be a blowout? That's going to factor into the game script, as we know. But, I just think that I guess it to some degree, and I don't want to circle back to the quarterbacks, but it comes down to how you feel about Heineke in place of Fitzpatrick in this matchup.
Yeah, and by the way, one of the other reasons that earlier in the week I took the Giants with the points is, well, number one, we have projections over on the site that project fair lines for the game. We have the line projected to be at 2.5. So when we have the line projected at 2.5 and the number is 4.5, that's already something you're like, okay, that's going across the key number. There's value here. The other thing also, though, is if this is going to be a really low scoring game, then it just kind of makes a little more sense to be with the side of the points when it's 4.5 anyway, just because if Washington wins, there's a cap on how many points we could legitimately expect them to win by in a game that isn't expected to feature that much scoring. But yeah, this is a game also where it's hard to trust anybody on offense. I don't feel good about anything on the offense from either of these teams.
So you wouldn't then be, I don't know, I guess we'll get to Superstar a little bit later on as we're doing our breakdown, but Antonio Gibson, is that not a guy that you'd feel comfortable putting in the Superstar spot as, just as we talk about the running backs?
Relative to the other options on the slate, yes, absolutely. However, the relative to like what does confidence mean, right? Do I feel like he's going to go out and just be, steamrolling everybody? No, probably not. We have him there's 3 players we have projected to be the top scoring player at a clip much higher than everybody else. Taylor Heineke, 22% chance to be the top overall fantasy scorer in this game. Daniel Jones, 22.2% chance. Antonio Gibson, 22.7. So I think it makes a whole lot of sense to mix and match those 3 guys as your superstar play. But with that said, am I outright confident that Antonio Gibson's going to have a massive game? No, I don't feel confident about anybody from an offensive side here. So that's also why I think it makes sense to maybe take some risks and go with some lower owned superstar plays as well.
All right, well, let's talk about the receivers then. And again, Heineke, Jones, Gibson, Barkley, those are your top 4 in terms of projections in that order. So you got to get to 5th before you get to a receiver, and that's Terry McLaurin for Washington. Again, shouldn't shock anybody. He is projected for just about a dozen points. He's $23, so he's right there near the top. You're paying up for him. After that, Sterling Shepard, Kenny Golladay, obviously both of the Giants. You can get Brown, Adam Humphries, Darius Slayton, lower projected guys. So how top heavy would you want to go on the wideouts here versus getting some value in?
Yeah, here's one issue I have with some of the pricing here. So Kenny Golladay did not get targeted very much last week for the Giants, and considering that number one, he's new to the team, and then number two, also he missed almost all of preseason training camp because he had a hamstring issue. It seemed unlikely he was even going to end up playing in week 1. I know Daniel Jones targeted him down the stretch of that game, and then that ultimately led to some garbage time points. But on the whole, Kenny Golladay was pretty quiet when that game mattered, and it seemed like the number one guy in week one for Daniel Jones was Sterling Shepard. And it's only one game. It doesn't mean it's going to carry over going forward. But I do think there's something to just a lack of reps that Daniel Jones and Kenny Golladay have had together. So I don't think the pricing is quite correct on Yahoo. I think that Kenny Golladay is a bit too expensive. I think Sterling Shepard is a bit too cheap. So my overall favorite receiver play from the Giants side is Sterling Shepard at $13. I think that number should be up quite a bit. And then for Kenny Golladay at $20, I'd rather play Mclaurin at receiver. I'd rather play Sterling Shepard, and I'd rather play every other player who's priced a little bit above him also. So the only player that is $20 plus or over, say over $20 that I don't like more than that I don't prefer to Saquon Barkley is Kenny Golladay. I'd rather roster Barkley than Golladay.
Yeah, I was just going to say, looking at the price points, again, Mclaurin at 23, Golladay at 20, as you noted. And, then from there, obviously, it goes down. You have guys where you would expect them to be, like Slayton around 11, Humphreys around 10. But Shepard, based on what he did last week versus what he's projected to do at just $13 and sandwiched between Mclaurin and Golladay in terms of the projections, is he a virtual must roster to the extent that exists in a showdown format?
For cash games, I would say yes. For tournaments, no. There's never anybody that's a must play, other than I would say I think that every lineup has to have one of the quarterbacks between Heineke and Jones. But there's nobody I would say like, if you're building 50 lineups, you have this guy in 100% of them. But I would say yes, in cash games, very high priority if you happen to play cash games. But for tournaments, no, you don't have to, because there's still other places to look. There's a lot of cheap players in this game.
7 for 9, 113, a touchdown last week for Sterling Shepard. Obviously, a great debut for him. Brown is the guy that really pops up when it comes to optimal lineups as far as, cheaper plays. He's $10. He's projected for, 6 to 7 points in that range. Is he your it's the variance discussion, right? It's the wild card. It's the, to some degree it is dart throwing, especially when you're talking about a showdown format in general. But is he the guy that you expect to kind of sneak up and make an impact here if you're looking for a value?
Yeah, it's really hard to know what to make of Diami Brown. So I know if you look at our projections for this week, we do have Brown, at least in terms of prop betting. We have him as one of the best prop bets today for over his yardage prop. I forget exactly what the number is off the top of my head, but I was looking at some of those projections today. I really like the over. Here's the positive with Diami Brown. He was on the field almost every single play last week. He ran a bunch of routes. He was on for almost every single passing play. Here's the downside. He was targeted 4 times. He caught one of those passes for -2 yards. Those are subpar results. He's still a rookie that we don't have all that much information on. He's a 3rd round pick, so also somebody who it's not like he was a 1st round pick they used a ton of draft capital on. It seems he's going to be on the field a lot, but it's still hard for me to reason with how much does the snaps matter with the lack of targets and production, and then also combined with I don't really trust the quarterback that he is throwing to him in Taylor Heineke. So in terms of just a punt play, yes, he's certainly a pretty high priority. But I'd rather get to Sterling Shepard if I'm rostering a cheap wide receiver on Yahoo.
Sean in the chat talking about Brown as massive chalk. Everybody and their brothers talking about him. And yeah, he'll be chalky, but I don't know, so massive to the point where, again, you feel like you got to have him to keep up, or is he just one of those GPP flyers?
Let's see. I don't remember what I had him in the builds I made before, but I mean, he's still, of the players that are priced $10.
I've got him at 31% owned in the optimal, again, running 100 projection lineups.
He's the number one priority of anybody who's priced $10. But if I'm going cheap, I still prefer Sterling Shepard, and it's $13 versus $10. I don't find it massively problematic in terms of lineup building on this slate. So Sterling Shepard's still the higher priority on the cheap end of the wide receivers, but Diami Brown, I do think on a points per dollar basis is the best pass catching play from Washington.
What's your read on the tight ends? You got Kyle Rudolph, again, no Evan Ingram. So you have Kyle Rudolph, who was targeted a handful of times last week, didn't do much with him, but he was at least, he was available to Daniel Jones. We can look at it that way. He was in his sights. On the other side, Logan Thomas didn't probably get nearly as much run as, I might have expected. He was only targeted 3 times, but he made all 3 catches. He had a touchdown. So, he proved his worth. He made a lot of fantasy owners happy. But how are you looking at that position for this one?
I like Logan Thomas. I don't really like Kyle Rudolph. So with Logan Thomas, he had a lot of success last year when Taylor Heineke was a quarterback. We saw a game which was I was talking about this one the other day, but the game that Taylor Heineke started down the stretch of the regular season for Washington, he locked into to Logan Thomas a ton in that game. I think Logan Thomas ended up getting targeted like 9 times, caught 7 passes. So we've seen the two of them work together well before. And also, I don't know how willing Washington is going to be to have Heineke throw the ball downfield. And that situation also where he could throw shorter passes to your tight end, which bringing up the box score of that game against the Panthers, Taylor Heineke ended up throwing the ball to Logan Thomas. Thomas finished with 7 catches for 63 yards, but he was targeted 12 times in that game. So it was a target share of right around 25% that game. And that's still something I expect to be the case today with Heineke quarterback. I think his number one option is going to be Logan Thomas. He's the guy who I would expect to ultimately get the most amount of targets with Heineke quarterback. With that in mind, at the price point, I think that he could use to be a little bit more expensive. I like Logan Thomas. As for Kyle Rudolph, he's nothing more than a flyer. I have no real confidence in him producing anything this year.
Won't surprise anyone, but the Washington football team defense is projected to have a better night than that of the Giants, basically 10 points versus about 7.5. They're priced kind of similarly. Again, unsurprisingly, Washington is a few bucks more, but how inclined are you, especially given this matchup, given these quarterbacks, given all the slander we've put on these two teams here in the last half hour? Do you want to have that defense in there, Washington in particular?
Yeah, both the defenses make sense, but they're still not really priorities because if we're being realistic about the defense and the offense in this spot, Washington's defense is priced at $20. And before when I was talking about players, $20, I wasn't really considering the defenses also, but you ultimately get to a point where, all right, who's going to score more fantasy points? Saquon Barkley or Washington's defense? Who's going to score more fantasy points? Terry McLaurin or Washington's defense? Daniel Jones and Washington's defense are the exact same price. We have Daniel Jones projected for 16.43 fantasy points. We have Washington's defense projected for 9.67 fantasy points. So as far as defenses go, it's a sensible spot for Washington, especially because Daniel Jones, we know about his turnover issues. If Washington ends up forcing a strip sack or something like that, ends up scoring a touchdown the other way, that would not be surprising to me whatsoever. But the most likely outcome here is certainly that Daniel Jones scores more fantasy points than Washington's defense. So at the $20 price point, it's a low priority play. And similar goes for the Giants.
Quarterbacks will be the chalk at the superstar position. Do you agree with it? And if so, who do you want?
Yeah, I think the priority at the superstar spot, it's going to be Heineke, Jones, and Antonio Gibson for me. Looking at our projections, we have about 22% chance for each of them to be the highest scorer on the slate. So I think just based on that, they are the most likely players. But I also want to take some chances on some of these other players in the game who are more ancillary pieces. So, we talked about Logan Thomas. Logan Thomas, I don't think anybody's really going to play him in the superstar spot. I still think that he's a chance that he ends up being optimal. Same goes for somebody like Sterling Shepard. I don't think he's going to be very popular in the captain spot, and I think there's a chance that he ends up being optimal. So there are some ways to roster some guys who are a little bit off the beaten path that I don't think the fielder's going to be on that I do think have a minimal amount of upside, at least relative to other players in this contest.
Look how quickly a half hour goes by when you're having fun. I only hope the game tonight is as good.
It won't be, but we could hope. We could hope.
Yeah, I'm with you. If I'm to, and this will be the chalk. This is not a hot take. I'm inclined to go Taylor Heineke at the superstar spot if I'm making a lineup for Yahoo. Although, and this might be a hot take, although not based on what you outlined for projected highest scorers, but certainly in terms of ownership, I would rather go Gibson in that slot as opposed to Daniel Jones. I don't know why. Maybe it's just my confidence in Washington going out and winning this game, and especially with some late run for Gibson trying to kill clock and that type of thing. Maybe he breaks one off for a touchdown. And I'm just not a big Daniel Jones guy. I think that all factors into it as well. But no doubt the quarterbacks are going to be the chalkiest of the superstars, and as we noted, both very highly owned as well. But if for those out there in the chat that noted they were going to fade one or both QBs, good. Fortune favors the bold. All right, real quick, want to tell you guys our Awesemo Plus NFL Express weekly package is $3.95. It's the best way to introduce yourself to Awesemo Plus. NFL included is our access to the NFL DFS player and ownership rankings, as well our expert Slack channel, and everything that we have to offer for showdown and single game contests. Make sure you check it out. Our thanks again to Yahoo, our presenting sponsor, and of course Jordan Klein. Jordan, the man behind the mask, We haven't shown him to you because we don't want to scare you, but he makes all this possible. Greg Ehrenberg, Adam Kaufman, back with you again, hopefully next week. Rust is off. It's good to be back. Greg, we'll catch you next time.
Yeah, later, man.